In building after building, the elevator stops at 12 and then jumps straight to 14. The missing floor is real, but its name has been erased. That absence looks harmless, even quaint. But across the world, 13 has been pushed out of sight in ways most people never notice. Hotels skip it. Hospitals skip it. Airports and towers skip it too. A number has been treated like a problem everywhere at once. The strange part is that nobody had to order this. No global law banned 13. The emission spread on its own like a quiet contagion. To understand why, you have to go backward. Long before fear attached itself to 13, the number carried a very different meaning. In the old lunar calendars, 13 was not a warning. It was a rhythm, tied to the moon's repeated return across the year. A solar year contains roughly 13 lunar months. That means nature itself seems to point toward 13, not away from it. But modern calendars force everything into 12 months. The fit is awkward, and the calendar has to be patched again and again. That mismatch is where the mystery deepens. If 13 fits the sky better, why did so many systems settle on 12 instead? The Mayans answer that question in a striking way. Their sacred Tzolkin cycle placed 13 at the center of time itself. It was not decoration. It tracked the heavens with precision, from Venus cycles to eclipse seasons, and 13 was built into that design. The same pattern appears in other cultures too. Aztec, Egyptian, Celtic, Norse, and native traditions all preserved versions of 13. Across continents and centuries, 13 kept returning as a symbol of cycles, thresholds, and cosmic transition. That repetition is difficult to dismiss. Then the pattern shifts from calendars to buildings. 13 begins disappearing from elevators, room numbers, and floor plans, as if someone wanted it unseen. No official rule created that habit, yet the result became remarkably consistent, from one country to the next, almost like a silent agreement. In aviation, the emission spread even further. Some airlines skipped row 13, explaining it away as customer comfort rather than fear. But comfort never explains the full story. These same companies still accept cramped seats and harsh conditions, so the real motive feels deeper. So why avoid it at all? One clue lies in the way 13 resists neat division, while 12 breaks perfectly into smaller parts. That makes 12 useful for organization, while 13 feels stubborn, irregular, and harder to tame. In older traditions, that stubbornness may have been power. Once a number becomes inconvenient, the next step is to make it frightening, and one story, repeated for centuries, did exactly that. The Last Supper placed 13 people at one table, followed by betrayal. That image became one of the strongest shadows ever cast on a number. And once fear settled in, language gave it a name: triskaidekaphobia. A number was no longer just avoided, it was treated like a disorder. But the deeper mystery is what vanished before the fear. Many older records tied 13 to spiritual passage, seasonal order, and living time. Then came the standard systems, the repaired calendars, and the carefully controlled versions of history. When time itself changed, 13 was the first thing to disappear. So the real question is not why people feared 13. It is why entire systems kept teaching us to live without it, and what else was erased with it. The first place to look is not folklore, but bookkeeping. In medieval Europe, merchants, clergy, and kings all preferred systems that divided cleanly into 12. 12 meant order. It matched the months, the zodiac, the hours on a clock face, and the neat arithmetic rulers loved to display as divine harmony. 13 broke that neat symmetry. It suggested one step beyond completion, a number that refused to sit quietly inside the old, orderly frame. That is why the old lunar calendars matter so much. A year, marked by 13 moon cycles, made 13 feel less like an anomaly and more like a natural count. This is where the story shifts from superstition to power. When a calendar stops reflecting the sky and starts serving administration, numbers begin to matter politically. The Maya understood that better than most. Their Tzolkin was not decorative numerology. It was a working machine for tracking celestial cycles with precision. Their priests watched Venus, eclipses, and solar turning points. 13 was embedded in a calculation system that tied ritual time to observable movement in the heavens. And they were not alone. Across the ancient world, 13 kept appearing in sacred systems, as if different cultures had touched the same underlying rhythm. In Egypt, 13 was linked to the soul's ascent after death. In Mesopotamia, it marked transition, not disaster. The number carried meaning at the threshold. That makes the later hostility feel less accidental. If 13 represented transition, then flattening it into a curse would be a powerful way to redefine what transition meant. That pan did not stay in one place. It slipped into architecture, and then into habit, until the missing 13th floor started to feel normal. Once an elevator skips a floor, the lie becomes physical. Passengers accept the absence before they ever question why the floor was removed at all. Hotels copied that logic, then hospitals, then transport terminals. The pattern spread without a global decree, which is exactly why it feels so carefully normalized. That absence is important. When a practice spreads everywhere without formal law, it often means institutions are reinforcing one another until the omission feels natural. The same kind of omission appears in motorsport. The number 13 has vanished from certain racing histories, not because it was impossible, but because it was unwelcome. When a number disappears from public records, the justification usually sounds harmless. But if every industry repeats the same small omission, harmless becomes coordinated looking. To see the deeper logic, look at the mathematics. 12 is easy to divide, easy to package, easy to turn into schedules and categories. 13 resists that treatment. It does not divide neatly, so it behaves like an interruption inside a system built on clean partitions. That is why older traditions treated it as a boundary number. Crossing a boundary can mean death, initiation, or transformation depending on who controls the story. Later institutions preferred the word curse. It is easier to control a boundary when people fear it instead of studying what it once represented. One question remains: who benefited from that fear? Not every answer has to be secret to be revealing. Sometimes the benefit is simply simplified control, because once a society agrees to live with missing numbers, it also learns to accept missing histories. The absence becomes normal, and normal becomes invisible. That is why the surviving 13-based calendars matter so much. They are not curiosities, they are witnesses to a different way of measuring reality. And those witnesses suggest something uncomfortable. The forbidden number was not merely feared, it was pushed aside because it resisted the systems built around it. So the real mystery is not why 13 frightened people. It is why so many powers preferred a world that worked without it, and what they hoped we would never notice. The strange thing is not that 13 was feared. It is that older civilizations treated it as a threshold, a number tied to change, passage, and renewal. In Europe, the superstition hardened after centuries of church storytelling and courtly repetition. By the time modern buildings rose, the omission already felt natural to most people. That is why some of the earliest practical uses of the taboo appeared in architecture. A floor could exist, a level could be built, and yet the label vanished. Hotels made the habit famous. Guests could climb upward through every registered level and still never be told they had crossed 13, even when the mechanics said they had. Hospitals followed for a different reason. Administrators feared anxious patients, so they erased the number from wards and corridors, as if language itself could calm the mind. Airlines copied the pattern, but with colder logic. A seat number was skipped, and the passenger never knew whether the missing number was comfort theatre or quiet obedience. Then came racing, where numbers are identity. In some series, 13 simply disappeared from the track, replaced by a silence that no announcer ever explained. The deeper question is why so many institutions behaved alike without a central decree. Their consistency suggests a cultural script older than any single company or building code. That script became strongest when tied to religion. The Last Supper, with 13 at the table and betrayal in the room, gave the number a permanent stain. But the story did not begin there. Long before that image spread, lunar calendars already made 13 feel natural, because the moon itself kept returning in that rhythm. That is why the calendar itself matters. If time is measured in 12 neat boxes, then anything outside those boxes becomes invisible, even when nature disagrees. The Mayans understood this clearly. Their Tzolkin was not decorative symbolism. It was a working system built from 13 numbers and 20-day signs. It tracked Venus, eclipse seasons, and ritual turning points with precision. In that world, 13 was not a superstition at all, but an astronomical tool. The same logic appears in Mesopotamian records, where 13 marked the completion of one cycle and the opening of another. The number stood at the boundary. That boundary idea kept returning in Egypt, among the Celts, and in northern traditions. Different languages, same pattern. 13 as transition rather than threat. Yet once Rome became dominant, the story changed. Systems that favored order, taxation, and administration preferred divisions that could be easily split and filed. 13 resisted that logic. It did not divide cleanly, and that made it awkward in a world increasingly managed by accounting, schedules, and authority. That resistance may explain why so many later cultures spoke of 13 as sacred, dangerous, or complete. It was a number that refused to behave like the others. In Christian Europe, the label shifted again. Instead of a boundary number, 13 became attached to betrayal, disorder, and the fear of what happens after the meal ends. Once that association existed, institutions could hide behind it. They no longer needed arguments about astronomy or ritual. Fear had already done the work for them. That is why the missing number became invisible in plain sight. People learned not to ask why the floor was absent, only to accept that it was missing, and yet the older records never fully disappeared. Fragments survived in calendars, temple mathematics, and oral memory, hinting that the forgotten system was once everywhere. So the real mystery is not whether 13 once mattered. It is why so many modern systems found it safer to function as if it never had. If you remove the number that measures the cycle, you also weaken the memory of the cycle itself. That is the quiet power hidden inside a forbidden number. And if that is true, then 13 was never merely unlucky. It was a number that pointed back to another way of measuring time, one that still waits to be rediscovered. At this point, the trail leads away from superstition and into administration. The real power of 13 may have been buried not in myths but in paperwork, ledgers, and official redesign. That shift begins with the institutions that standardize time. Once empires favored cleaner, simpler divisions, the irregular month counts had to be broken apart and disguised. The month that would not fit became the month that had to be hidden. In practical terms, that meant adding, trimming, and renaming until the sky no longer matched the calendar. That is why the argument is so unsettling. 13 was not erased by nature, but by design. A system built around 12 could not tolerate an extra rhythm outside its control. In ancient systems, 13 often marked completion, not danger. It stood at the threshold where one cycle ended and another quietly began. That is the hidden meaning behind so many lunar traditions. A year of 13 moon cycles was not chaos to them, it was alignment with visible sky. The deeper clue is how often those traditions linked 13 to transitions, harvests, and celestial turning points. It was a number of passage, not punishment. In Mesoamerica, this logic became especially precise. The calendrical systems did not guess at the heavens, they tracked them with disciplined mathematical care. What matters is not just the symbolism, but the engineering behind it. A sacred number survives longer when it is useful for measuring the world. Across cultures, the same pattern appears in different forms, because the sky was the common reference. Different peoples named it differently, but they were often counting the same turning point. Then the story reaches Europe, where older lunisolar habits begin to fade beneath imperial order. Once a calendar becomes policy, memory starts to thin. A reform does not need to announce itself as a conquest. It only has to make the old rhythm look inconvenient, then let the new order seem inevitable. That is why 13 became dangerous. It resisted easy division. 12 can be broken into neat civic units, but 13 remains stubborn, awkward, and independent. The result was not simply avoidance, but concealment. When systems prize order above accuracy, anything that disrupts the grid gets pushed quietly to the edge. Later, the fear was reinforced by story. The Last Supper gave the number a dramatic association with betrayal, and that image proved far easier to remember than astronomy. But stories only matter when institutions repeat them. Once churches, courts, and schools echo the same warning, a symbol can harden into common sense. That is how fear becomes etiquette. People stop asking why the number is avoided, because the avoidance itself begins to feel natural, almost polite. Then the physical world copied the idea. Buildings skipped 13, airlines skipped 13, and race teams treated the number like a contaminant rather than a count. Once that happens, the excuse no longer matters. Whether the motive was fear, convenience, or control, the result is the same. The number disappears from public space. Yet some places never fully accepted that erasure. Ethiopia preserved a 13-month calendar, keeping time in a form that never surrendered to the simpler imperial model. That survival matters because it proves the old rhythm was not fantasy. It was workable enough to remain alive, even while the dominant world chose another measure. The same is true of the surviving fragments in Europe and the Americas. Whenever old records appear, they reveal not superstition, but an older science of timekeeping. And that is why this story keeps circling back to power. Whoever controls the calendar controls what feels normal, and what feels normal shapes belief. So the forbidden number may never have been feared for its own sake. It may have been feared because it remembered a different way of ordering reality. And if that older order was deliberately buried, then the real mystery is not why 13 vanished. The mystery is who benefited when the sky was no longer our calendar. That buried order did not disappear by accident. Once calendar shifted, the people who controlled dates also controlled dues, seasons, and harvest deadlines. A 13-month rhythm was harder to bend. It followed the moon too closely, which meant authority had to keep adjusting itself to nature. So the system was simplified. 12 became easier to divide, easier to file, easier to teach, and easier to govern from the center. But 13 resisted that neatness. It sat outside easy division, and that made it feel less like a number and more like a warning. That is why the number had to be turned into superstition. Fear is useful when you need people to reject something before they examine it. Hotels removed the 13th floor. Hospitals skipped room numbers. Airports and towers followed the habit until it looked universal. No global law ordered that pattern, yet the same omission spread across countries as if the decision had been made somewhere deeper than policy. The same logic reached the sky. Airlines skipped row 13, then called it passenger comfort, even while packing travelers into tighter and tighter cabins. That excuse collapses under pressure. Comfort was never the point. Compliance was, because repeated omission teaches the public what to stop questioning. Racing carried the same wound. The 13 entry vanished from some starting grids, not through accident, but through habit, repeated until it felt natural. Once a symbol starts disappearing everywhere at once, you are no longer looking at coincidence. You are looking at cultural programming in motion. The old rituals behind 13 were not random either. They tied the number to moon cycles, thresholds, and the moment one pattern ends and another begins. That is why the number mattered. It marked transitions that could not be fully owned, and systems built on ownership rarely celebrate what they cannot contain. Then came the stories that made 13 feel cursed. The Last Supper, the betrayal, the lonely place reserved for the 13th guest. Once that image settled into the culture, the number itself became suspicious. A symbol linked to transition was recast as a sign of danger. Modern language even gave that fear a diagnosis, triskaidekaphobia. The label made the reaction sound scientific, which helped bury the original question. Because once fear is medicalized, nobody asks who designed the fear in the first place. The symptom gets named, and the cause disappears behind it. The destruction of older records made that easier. If calendars, codices, and temple archives vanish, then alternate systems become folklore overnight. That loss is the real rupture. Not just the loss of paper, but the loss of a way to measure the world without asking permission from rulers. Even architecture obeyed the new logic. Buildings learned to pretend the 13th level did not exist, because invisible numbers are easier to govern. And yet some places still remember another structure. Ethiopia's 13-month calendar survives, reminding us that time can be counted differently. That living system is important, because it proves suppression was never total. The old rhythm survived where the local order resisted outside simplification. So the forbidden number may never have been truly forbidden at all. It may simply have been replaced by a system that preferred cleaner control. Because if you can change the count, you can change the memory. And if you can change the memory, you can make an older truth feel imaginary. That leaves one unsettling question. If 13 was edited out so thoroughly, what else have we mistaken for superstition when it was really a system at work? What if the same kind of erasure reached beyond numbers, into time itself, and removed an hour so quietly that the clock still never confessed?